Well, it won't surprise you, Mr. President. I rise to speak against it for a number of reasons. In no particular order. The first is that this bill is unconstitutional. These machines are unconstitutional. And the case law on that is as clear as can be. The language of our own Constitution is as clear as can be. Section 226 of Kentucky's Constitution is expressly and explicitly clear. It permits lotteries and charitable gaming. Subsection 3 of Section 226 explicitly excludes everything that isn't a lottery or charitable gaming. The Jockey Club case from 1931, 90-year-old precedent that we still have that hasn't been overruled, says pari-mutuel wagering is not a lottery. It's funny because back at the time, Section 226 was the opposite of what it is today. It said lotteries are expressly prohibited. So the court had a lot of reason to make sure that it wasn't a lottery. Well, in 92, 226 flipped. This legislature, some of you, not me, I wasn't even quite in high school yet in 92. But this legislature passed an amendment that went on the ballot, and the voters decided to make 226 what it is today. They could have done any number of things, could have expanded it beyond those two express and explicit things, a state-run lottery and charitable gaming, but they went out of their way to be explicit and narrow. This doesn't meet that definition. A plain reading of the Constitution simply says this doesn't fit. If the senator from Boone wants this proposal, he should withdraw this bill and introduce a constitutional amendment. I'd vote no on that too for reasons I'm going to get to in a second because I'm philosophically opposed to gaming. But at least then I couldn't complain that the procedure is wrong. I couldn't complain that we're violating the Constitution. That would be the way to do this. That's what we should be doing, but we're not. It is unconstitutional. You know, the bill doesn't do anything to explicitly take care of live horse racing. Now, we've heard from the senator, we've heard from the advocate community that with the revenue generated from these machines, that purses have gone up. I've never seen a spreadsheet that shows exactly how many dollars have gone into these purses, but I don't question that. I assume that that's accurate, that the purses have gone up. The Family Foundation shared a stat that I hadn't done the research on. Churchill Downs over the last 10 years has performance almost on GameStop level for its stock price because of how well these machines have done. And Churchill Downs, and that's not the only track, but that's certainly I think the leader in the Commonwealth, and certainly the one that we're most familiar with, owns the facility that's brand new in Christian County. So it seems to be doing well. I don't know that that's trickling down to the people that work on the tracks. $11 an hour wage average, I'm told. But there's nothing in this bill that guarantees those people get to benefit from this money. There's no language in this bill anywhere that guarantees the purses are going to go up at all. There's no guarantee. There's nothing in this bill that says live racing is protected. And we're going to make sure live racing is kept around. As it is, these tracks exist for the sake of their casino floors and these slot machines. They have 5 or 6 race days a year. Nothing in here to protect that. I asked the question about the machines, and I wonder, do the members of this body even know the details about these machines? Do you know the manufacturers of them? Do you know how many are at each location? How many of you, if polled right now, could say how each one of these machines work? How, other than a couple of you that I know could answer that question. But I suspect the balance of this body couldn't do it. Couldn't explain that. But here we are, we're going to legislate on it. We're going to pass a policy that defines pari-mutuel wagering. But we can't identify whether or not we think these machines work the way the Supreme Court's ruling in September says they do. Only one track has closed down. But Oak Grove hasn't shut down. Ellis Park hasn't shut down. Turfway, Kentucky Downs. I'm not aware of any others that have closed their operations. Is that because the machines are different? Do we know that? Can anybody answer that question? I was on KET last night. Didn't get a clear answer to the question then. I posed it then. But sure, let's rush headlong into policy making on that. Gaming in all its forms is predatory and bad public policy. It's an industry predicated on the losses of its patrons. There's no equal bargain or consideration between the parties. There's got to be a loser consistently, or the industry falls apart. You just heard from the senator from Boone. They got to make sure that there's a loss somewhere, or the industry can't survive. And for the government to get in bed with an industry that requires its people to lose, for the industry to succeed, I think we're doing our people a great disservice. It preys on the poor. It preys on those hoping, wishing that their next play is the one that makes it big, that gets them out of poverty, that gets them out of squalor or whatever they're in, and they're not all that. I like to tell a story. I used to work for a petroleum jobber down in Hopkinsville when I was in between school semesters, and I remember having to go to the various convenience stores, and I had a certain route. I'd hit the same ones all the time. I had the same job to do at each one of these convenience stores, and I'd be there for a while. I'd have to work on a spreadsheet, stick the tanks. Anyway, I'd be there, and I'd see this one guy at the same convenience store in Hopkinsville go and get a scratch-off game or a stack of them, and he'd go sit at the booth, and the booth tabletop would be covered in the scratch-off residue from those cards. And I'd watch him, poor white trash guy, and he'd play whatever money he had. He'd get scratch-off games, and he'd go right back up there and take whatever winnings he had, and he'd buy more cards, and he'd come right back to the table and do it again. There will be patrons of these places. There are patrons of these places that are in just as bad a financial shape, but they'll walk back in the door time and time again because they think the next time is going to be the time they win. The very government that these people are relying on is going to be funded by their losses. The losses, I'll remind you, are from finite dollars that circulate in our communities. It's a fixed number of monies that our people have. And a dollar lost at a racetrack on one of these machines is a dollar not given to the United Way, not given to the Rape Crisis Center, not given to the Crisis Pregnancy Center, not given to a food bank, not going to a church offering plate. The losses that are lost there are dollars not spent on clothing for your family, groceries for your children, college money, gas money, bus money. Even the Supreme Court in that 1931 case appreciated the dangers of gaming. They were talking about lotteries at the time, and they said this, that lotteries, quote, infested the whole community, entered every dwelling, reached every class, preyed upon the hard earnings of the poor, and plundered the ignorant and simple. They knew that about gaming 90 years ago. But by all means, let's enable that today. You know, a friend of mine from around home talks about his childhood memories of traveling to Atlantic City. He used to go before the casino showed up, and it was a beautiful place. He loved going. It was spectacular. His family loved going. And then the casino showed up in the 70s. And the casinos thrived, but the rest of the place dried up. All the local businesses dried up. It eventually, all the other societal ills that come with gaming started showing up: prostitution, drug use, crime. He tells the story passionately. He's a Democrat from back in my area. He has seen what happens there, and that's the direction we're going. Gambling leads to corruption. Follow the money. Wherever large sums of money are at stake, corruption can often be found. History is replete with examples of corruption where gaming in particular is involved. Just in the last few years, it was discovered that several of Kentucky's tracks, at either the direction or invitation of the Horse Racing Commission, paid for a consultant to write the regs to which they were subject. That happened here. Even now, the Horse Racing Commission conspicuously isn't subject to executive branch ethics rules. And we've already talked about the amendments. Senate Bill 153 is hopefully going to pass committee, and I hope it's before this body soon, that changes that and puts the commission underneath executive branch ethics. And there are a number of people who support that, including the sponsor of this bill and others in both the House and the Senate, and I'm grateful for that support. However, that's small comfort for those who will be hurt by what these machines allow. We're talking about advancing a policy we know going in will harm many of our people. We know that gambling addiction is real and brings financial hardships to individuals and families that have to battle with it, yet so many of you will run into the warm embrace of gaming. Even in this short session, and certainly in years prior, we've heard speeches on the floor about the plight of the poor, the oppressed, and the marginalized. Don't you dare say that again to the senator from Christian if you vote for this bill. A bill that we all know is going to hurt people in our communities. These machines have already hurt people in my community. They will hurt people in the other communities where they exist, just like the lottery has done. Don't cry about that to me the next time you see an issue like that. Not if you're going to support this. But Whitney, shouldn't people be allowed to spend their money wherever they want to? Stay out of my wallet, they exclaim. I agree with that to a point. As a conservative, I think we ought to be able to spend our money where we wish. But I also think if we were to check everybody in this room, we probably all agree that there ought to be some limits to that. If you don't believe there should be limits to that, in the name of liberty, in the name of personal freedom, then I look forward to voting against your bill to legalize prostitution or heroin or pick some other controlled substance. We've got to draw the line somewhere. We have drawn a line somewhere. The bill is a bailout. The horse racing industry knew from the beginning that what they were doing was legally questionable. The lawsuit that was resolved in September came from an action started in July of 2010. A one-sided action by the tracks and the proponents of historical horse racing, a marketing spin for these slot machines, a term. They started the action. In fact, the Supreme Court ruled in 2014, a unanimous decision then, if I'm not mistaken, and they talked about the fact that this would have been a problem. It was lopsided. There was no adversarial interest. The Family Foundation eventually resolved that by joining the action back in 2010. But the court spent some time talking about that. It was rigged. But they knew then. They were asking the court, are we doing something that we're allowed to do? They knew then that it was iffy. Litigation's been going on ever since, but they plowed ahead. They invested over the last 10 or 11 years, I'm told hundreds of millions of dollars. They've hired people. They've installed 3,625 of these machines, Senator from Boone. The surest bet they ever made was that if they were ever called out on the legality or the illegality of these machines, that they'd be able to quickly claim the very real economic harm from suddenly having to close. The very real job losses affecting real people, but don't fall for the charade. This legal defeat was not some out-of-the-blue ruling by a rogue judge. This wasn't an unexpected risk that couldn't be planned for and mitigated. The tracks knowingly built their houses on quicksand and then invested millions in renovations and additions, upgrading their interiors, installed the machines, and hired all their people. I feel confident none of the people that were hired were cautioned. And by the way, we're bringing you on board here, but we're fighting this in court. We hope we win. We think we might win. But just so you know, before we take this job, I'm sure that conversation didn't happen. But still, the tracks pressed onward. The tracks failed entirely to mitigate this risk on their own. In fact, they've done all they can to maximize the risk, and I believe they did so knowing that they'd be able to claim victimhood when asking us to save their necks. The senator from Boone says to ask what the message to the business community would be. I think that message is pretty clear if this bill passes. Engage in legally murky business practices long enough around an industry that tugs on the heartstrings of enough legislators, and caution of an economic catastrophe, and the legislature will come to the rescue. Meanwhile, what about other sectors of state government and their bailouts? Infrastructure, the Kentucky Chamber, my local chamber and fiscal court and yours have been asking us to pass a modern gas tax. Haven't done that. It's been kicking around for years. A truly modern gas tax. Schools. Our schools don't have textbooks or tablets. Our students don't. Our computer labs have keyboards with keycaps missing. Family resource and youth services centers are working overdrive to meet additional demands of students who don't have all they need. Winter coats and shoes, sometimes food. The senator from Grayson mentioned to a few of us a week or so ago that some of his students have been going to a local McDonald's to get on Wi-Fi to participate in school. Seek funding needs a huge shot in the arm to get districts back to a funding level they had 20 years ago. I assume your school districts are a lot like mine. They need new roofs, new buildings altogether. Transportation funding, all-day kindergarten. The rightfully praised school safety bill we passed 2 years ago could probably use an appropriation. What about moving something forward that strengthens the economic impact and trajectory of our youth? Pensions, once again, we're talking this year about our quasi-governmental agencies, these mission-critical organizations that do services no other part of state government is equipped to do. Your health departments, pretty important groups, I'd say, over the last calendar year. Your rape crisis centers, your children's advocacy centers, your community mental health centers. We've been kicking around this issue for several years, and I've been here for some of that. We haven't been able to solve that yet in a way that actually guarantees their bailout, to make sure they get the money they need to pay the pensions for their people. We still wait. State pay. Our social workers are overworked and underpaid. Our correctional workers are overworked and underpaid. I think the Department of Corrections still has the ignominious title of the highest turnover rate in the Commonwealth. A few years ago, they were paying their folks, or requiring their folks to work 12-hour shifts and mandatory overtime. Our state lab folks, they're near and dear to my heart, who in the course of their important work are exposed to controlled substances, bodily substances, extremely dangerous and toxic substances, biohazards and sharps, and they're keeping our justice system moving for everyone, the accused and the victims alike. They handle more than 40,000 case assignments from over 500 agencies around the state every year, and in the last several years, we've spent almost $400,000 training them to lose them to our surrounding states, who all pay them at least $10,000, if not $20,000 more for equivalent positions. We've got 5 vacancies right now. We can't fill them. Where's the bailout for them? And they didn't do anything to cause it. They're doing their work. Don't even get me started on why they should have hazard pay. They should. I've just scratched the surface. Y'all know that. These are just a handful of the fires we need to be putting out. Some of them have been building and blazing for years, if not decades. The Supreme Court issued its ruling on these slot machines 138 days ago. I count 63 lobbyists representing the interests of the tracks and the gaming industry. Local chambers, economic development groups, and our constituents have been activated. Imagine the incredible generational impact we could have if the same effort and tenacity was aimed at solving the crises that directly affect us all, that could improve our people's lives and not take from them. Instead, we're being asked to step in and rescue an industry from its own blunder. They're not to blame for the economic hardship of the horse racing and live horse racing. They're not to blame for that. But again, they knew what they were walking into with these machines, because they started the legal question to ask from the beginning. They knew 11 years ago what they were doing was questionable. They wanted an answer to the question. And instead of taking the prudent course of either waiting for the litigation to resolve, which they may or may not have been able to do, waiting 10 years may not have been a realistic thing, or pursuing a constitutional amendment a decade ago to address this very question, which they could do today. In short, the House bet it all and they lost. And now they're asking us to do what they would never consider doing for their betters, make them whole. Behind the legal arguments and the policy arguments are a bunch of real people whose jobs and livelihoods are impacted by this. I understand that. No one in this chamber or the other chamber wishes to cost anyone jobs or do harm to hardworking Kentuckians, but don't be fooled. The real harm was done long before now, when the tracks moved ahead on that bad bet. And remember as you vote, the harm these slot machines, these racinos, are already doing. Just this weekend, I received a note from a pastor in West Kentucky, and he's got a church member whose spouse has died recently. And the widow's having to settle gambling debts of her late husband. And she talks about how, to the pastor who relayed this in the note, he said, some of these debts came from Metropolis or somewhere else, but most of it was earned and built right at Oak Grove Gaming Floor. It just opened in September. Remember that these are real people whose jobs and livelihoods are impacted by your decision too. I urge you to vote no.